the introductory remarks, just to set the stage and frame our discussion a little bit. I'm very happy to be in Yerevan. It's my first time, and I am beyond impressed with the city. I'm also happy to be contributing to the gender balance, which I think is something we're going to have to improve a little bit on in the next editions. And since we're talking about how technology has changed conflict, I would like to pick up on something that's been said earlier by the Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs, because he said conflict doesn't end on the ground, it ends at the negotiating table. And I think that's something we might want to discuss or perhaps challenge. Because we are in the one place in Armenia which has seen how one other country can use this to extract concessions by making an incursion into a neighboring country, establishing a status quo and essentially forcing the victim country to negotiate. The same has been happening with Russia in Ukraine. And increasingly, I think, as Zbigniew Pisalski was saying earlier, if one bully can do that, then everybody else can turn this into a strategy, because the frontiers of conflict have been fluid, and it is hard to even define what constitutes a conflict and what doesn't. So then you can easily operate in this gray area and try to get away with murder without by getting everything that you want and without really being responsible for it. Now, a lot has been discussed also about changing world order, and I think it also merits saying that different powers seize the opportunity of a changing world order, perhaps not being appropriate any longer for global realities, to go beyond peaceful means to challenge the existing world order. And why do we need a world order anyway? Well, we need it, I guess, for goals that we all agree on, which is to have peace, prosperity, and stability worldwide. But let's not fool ourselves. When everything is fluid and in flux and changing, there's a world of opportunity for each and every individual actor not to necessarily push a collective agenda of peace and freedom and stability, but rather their own individual interests and agendas that might have nothing to do with world peace. They might just have a lot to do with immediate interests for that moment, for that particular actor, and with contestation becoming a trend, the temptation is there to throw away the rulebook altogether, which we could argue might have happened with conflict or not. We will see in our discussion. Challenging the existing order without proposing alternative rules, proposing no rules altogether, because it's easier to operate in an unregulated space. That is also a strategy that individual actors can use when everything is up for grabs. Hence, we see the multiplication of conflicts. And as I was saying earlier, we have hybrid, undefined conflicts. We have conflicts that we don't even recognize as such. We have attacks, let's call them that, against civilians, against society at large, whether through misinformation, disinformation. We have attacks against civilians. Again, we see this in Gaza, we see this in Ukraine. We have false flag operations, where again, the perpetrator doesn't take responsibility for what they do. We have attacks with new weapons, with drones. Again, that minimizes the risk for the perpetrator, opens a world of possibilities also for those trying to defend themselves. And we have a mix of old and new technologies. We see again, I will give the example of the conflict in Ukraine. We see how important technology is, and then at the same time we see how it doesn't solve all the problems, because you still need the people to be able to use them, and you still need a host of conventional equipment. And then last but not least, we have things like starvation, denying people access to sanitation, something that we have seen in Gaza repeatedly and in other parts of the world, which is also a form of warfare, but not necessarily one that we can, that the international law always recognizes as such. And again, it operates on the borderline. So all of these things we're going to try to clarify today with our speakers. I have asked them to keep their remarks very short, so we will have 15 minutes at the end for the Q&A session. I will ask you to keep your questions as focused and short as possible, and if possible, not comments, but rather questions so that we can have an interaction. And with this, let me move here. I hope this is also on. I think now it is. Okay. Sunjoy, not just because you're, oh, sorry. I was thinking of ORF too much. Yes. Not just because you're sitting closest to me, but I want to ask you about continuity and change. There are things that change, there are things that never really do. How would you define them? What do you think has changed? What do you think has not?
So let me begin by firstly kind of commenting on what you just said. One of the biggest problems today in the current global order is the inability of the United Nations Security Council to fulfill its role. It's essentially responsible for maintaining peace, security, and committing itself to the broad notion of development, and it's utterly failed. And the one clear reason why it's failed is it's really refused to reform itself over the past 8 decades or so. So the real question is, do you throw the baby out with the bathwater? The answer is no. I think it's a very good system, and simply because it has certain infirmities, it doesn't mean that the current global order should be challenged. But it's very clear that there has been no reform since 1965. The last time that there was any reform at the United Nations in the Security Council was when the non-permanent membership went up from 6 to 10, and that was way back in 1965. There's been no change since then. At the heart of the problem is the fact that there are veto-wielding powers, 5 of them, who don't see eye to eye. Now, they're supposed to work together, even a modicum of cooperation as they did during the Cold War. But today, in this particular era of major power conflict and confrontation, they've utterly failed to do so. So let me just end that capsule by saying the United Nations Security Council is hoist on its own petard. Unless they willingly give up their privileged status and move in for reforms, you're not going to see much of a change there. The second point I want to make is that we must not discount history and geography when it comes to the modern battlefield. And there is a certain continuity. History, the baggage of history is very important, but for me, geography is extraordinarily important. And let me give 3 quick examples. You are aware of Sir Halford Mackinder's heartland theory, and he had emphasized the importance of the heartland. By the way, that's the heartland where a lot of the action is taking place right now in the European theater in Ukraine. And he had spoken about pacifying the rimland in order to be able to dominate the world island and so on and so forth. And we are seeing some of that playing before our very eyes. The second example of geography is what the US strategic thinker Alfred Mahan had said about the Indian Ocean. He had said that whoever dominates the Indian Ocean will dominate Asia, and the Indian Ocean is key to the 7 oceans. And that is playing itself out in the Indo-Pacific today, where you see a country like China, for example, having grown exponentially on the economic front, also militarizing, and there is a fair bit of perception throughout Asia about coercion being used by the People's Republic of China, and many countries have misgivings about it. And the third example I want to give is about the South China Sea, where again geography plays a very important role. In 1933, there was a French admiral called Georges Maker, who traveled to 9 islands in the South China Sea and planted the French flag, France then being a dominant power alongside Japan in the South China Sea. He planted the French flag on 9 islands. And in Beijing, there was a self-taught geographer in the Foreign Office. His name was Mr. Pai Mei-chu. Mr. Pai Mei-chu took notice of what the French were doing, and he said that all geography and map making must be in the service of the nation. It must be out of love for your country that you draw maps and make maps. And he made such a map. That's the map that was published in 1936 with the cow's tongue, the U-shaped line, the 9-dash line as we call it today. Fast forward and you find that all these three geographies are experiencing a great deal of tumult. So geography is extremely important.
Can I just take the opportunity to make a very quick comeback to you, and I would like a quick answer, precisely because you're from outside of the EU. We like to say in the EU, since we also speak about the world order that's eminently European, that we have overcome history and geography. The EU has had a very troubled history, which comes from a complicated geography. Do you feel that that is the case, and is that something that the rest of the world still aspires to? Or is this just a very isolated phenomenon, both in time and in space?
Look, chaos and order are cyclical in nature. You will never have a period of time in history where there will be order for all times to come in a perennial manner, nor will you have chaos perennially. So this is sort of cyclical in nature, and I would say that Europe at one point of time gave the impression, like Southeast Asia, that it had resolved all its history and geography, the differences and the friction among themselves. But 7 decades later, I would say that the fundamental foundation of Europe has been shaken up. And I do not believe that the world would look to Europe today for any great example of seamless integration.
Thank you very much. Leonid, I would like to go to you because we've been discussing a bit about continuity, and you deal with military technology. Do you feel that technology has provided a degree of continuity, or has it provided really disruptive change?
I think that technology always changes, and this is a natural process. But when we had, let's say, decades of maybe not the peace, but much less of war worldwide, the defense technology was not well funded as before. During the Cold War, there was less probably development for after 91 and until 2010. 2015, but then we had the unmanned technologies coming a lot, and we have now also Russo-Ukrainian war, which is making technologies to develop much faster than during the peacetime. So you have all the West thinking about new technologies, you have Ukrainians thinking about technologies, you have Chinese and Russians and Iranians thinking of technologies. And nowadays, during the wartime, you don't need long tests to prove if your technology is bad or good. You just take the civilian FPV drone, put a RPG-7 grenade on it, and try it out if it works or not. And if it's working well, you think of further developments. And nowadays we see a combination of very expensive weapon systems, which large countries tend to procure and construct. And we see the civilian or dual-use tech sometimes showing to be even more effective than the expensive approaches. For example, the very well-known to Armenians Turkish Bayraktar TB2 combat drone was not effective at all on the front lines of Russo-Ukrainian war, and after half a year, after the start of it, almost all of them were lost. But we see the civilian tech being used already for 2.5 years, and we see the changes happening there. And we see the larger countries already starting to think about adapting to this new battlefield and about investing in creation of maybe simpler but cheaper and much more mass-produced products. Because we came to a moment when even middle power, which invested into dual use and civilian technologies a lot, into adaptation, can make a very big problems even to countries like Russia, United States. If you have munitions which cost $2,000-3,000 and air defense missiles which cost $2 million, you can't continue for years. Even large countries don't have budgets like that and production capacities. So the thing is about finding the new balance. And while this new balance is found, we will see many aggressive players being more effective, the proxy powers of different states being more effective because of the usage of cheaper technologies, and that can bring some destabilizing factor too.
Thank you very much. I think that's very interesting because it again goes back to the larger topic of changing world order, and then we see how middle powers, as you call them, can exercise actually perhaps an outsized influence depending on the circumstances. Stephanie, I would like to go to you to ask you, beyond the efficiency or lack thereof of these weapons, are there challenges that are that this poses from the perspective of civilians and of the rules of war and of the limitations within which we're used to carrying out conflicts?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for the question. I think it's very important that we discuss this issue, especially because things are happening very, very fast. Autonomous weapon system, you were speaking about drones before, you mentioned Parrikar and others, they're already reality. What we are not having yet are fully autonomous weapon systems, but we do have weapon systems which are already able to target and to engage with a target without actually a lot of human control. There is still some human control there, but I think we need to understand that the direction we are going is that systems are becoming more and more autonomous. And I don't think that in general autonomy in weapon system is something bad. So it's not really a black and white discussion. Obviously, you can use it for very, very, I would say, meaningful purposes. I mean, first of all, you don't really need to put your own soldiers there. So every army would actually like to invest in these systems. And I think it's very humane also to think about that. Or if you think about demining robot systems, like all those things, they are not really bad. The problem, however, is how far are we going to go with these developments in the systems? And is there a possibility that we can actually regulate those systems? So the discussion there in international law is more or less the following, that we are saying within an armed conflict, the international humanitarian law does apply also to autonomous weapon systems. However, we need to understand if they are developing, like how do we actually then frame responsibility, like at one point, who is responsible for a specific attack at one point. And then we do have the feeling, and we see it very often, that we are tending to over-rely on technical advances. So obviously they can be very, very meaningful, but I mean, we also see how many drones are actually not reaching their targets. It's not only a few, it's actually many. So this over-relying, then we need also to understand like how they are applying their, I mean, especially the deep learning models, how are they actually coming to their conclusions? Are we still understanding what data they are using, what algorithms they are using? And then we also need to consider, and I think it's very important, data is always biased. We know it a lot. We know it especially also from facial recognition systems, like how actually the algorithms are performing, depending on if it's a female, if it's a male, if it's another race. So all those issues are very, very important. And I do think, since we're speaking today about the overall motto of this conference is shaping the future already today. And I think especially when it comes to these topics, we need to discuss, do we need an amendment to existing protocols in international law? What about arms control? I come from the civil society, and I mean, and I'm European, I'm Austrian, and it was mentioned already that the war against Ukraine, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, is the most important security challenge for Europe these days. I think we forget to zoom a little bit outside, because if we look at the bigger picture, we do see that when it comes to what is going on, for example, the war of Israel against Palestinians after the horrible attack of October 7th might be more important for many, many other states when it comes to how the international world order is still functioning. How credible are we still when we say human rights is applicable? International humanitarian law, it definitely is applicable in the context of the war in Gaza, but we are very silent there. So saying that we want to have an established international order is very, very difficult if we actually do the cherry picking. So we only say international law, humanitarian law is important when it serves us. So I think what we need to do is we need to stick to international law every time and always, and we need to be very, very frank in speaking out about that. And maybe only one more thing, arms control. I hear now is not the times of arms control, because obviously European Union, the European states, especially Ukraine, we are literally facing, I would say, a conventional war, which we thought are a relic of the past. So we're speaking about armament. But nevertheless, I always think if you arms control is always the time to speak about. If you look at the Cold War, we spoke
I suggest we discuss this in the second round,
Okay.
just so we don't go too much into specifics, which we will do. I want to go to Werner Fasslabend to ask about, to continue the discussion on the human factor, and that is under these circumstances, as described, with autonomous weapon systems, with new technologies. How important is the human factor anymore? Not just in decision making and controlling algorithms, but in general, in the carrying out of wars.
Yeah, I think this is probably the most underestimated factor in all the strategies. Otherwise, it would not have been possible that Ukraine could have survived against the Russian invasion and so on. What is the very specific thing about it? Warfare, of course, does follow strategies like it was stated already by Clausewitz 200 years ago. It does have the components of power, of space, and of time. And if you look to power, it's not only the material, but of course it's also the human power. And especially in wars where one party tries to grab land, the human factor is a very decisive one. And what we can see now is that in both cases of the actual warfare now, in Ukraine and also in Gaza, there was a big surprise. Nobody expected that Ukraine really could withstand Russia for 2.5 years now, and after 2.5 years even invade Russian territory. And at the same time, nobody believed that it was possible, that Hamas could withstand this outstanding Israeli army practically a whole year. And they have not even found the head of the Hamas organization. And this shows us very clearly, that weapon systems and armament systems are very important. One must not underestimate them. And you have to also to look at them. I think back very often, when I visited northern Iraq just a few years ago, and I met the Peshmerga troops and asked the commander, what are the lessons for you? What are the most important factors? And he told me then, it's 3 factors. It's drones, it is tunnels, and it is snipers. And I'm thinking very often of this lesson he gave me when I'm talking about Ukraine on the one hand, but also Gaza at the other hand. When he talked about drones, they had drones only. Chinese production for children, This was toys. And they had bought it in Berlin and brought in the north of Iraq. But what followed afterwards was, of course, a revolution. And now this system certainly will revolutionize warfare in the future. In America, they are already discussing whether the next generation of combat aviation really should be constructed, yes or no, due to this fact. And at the other hand, also, there are big discussions about, the use of maritime carriers in the future due to this fact of enormous change of technology. What we see, and we were already talking about it, is of course that the question of cheap material certainly will be a very decisive one. But what we also could see in the Ukrainian war is that, for example, European countries delivered modern material, but the Ukrainian troops were not able to use it in the just way. And this meant that they fell back more or less to very traditional warfare. And you can see this also in many other cases. And insofar, it is always the question, you know, the human factor, not only the use of the armament, but especially the will of people, not only of the soldiers, but of the whole nation, probably is more decisive than a single very advanced armament system that you can bring into a warfare.
Thank you,
Insofar,
and can I use that to go to Priyank, because you mentioned to me before this session that you've been working on counterterrorism as well, and we've been mostly discussing, perhaps with the exception of Gaza, which is between a conflict between a state and a non-state entity, but we've mostly been discussing nation states. And I'm interested if this imbalance and the possibility and the availability of technology favors non-state actors also who have this will to fight, who are very radicalized at times, and then can they do more damage than before because technology actually allows that more than before?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and it's an honor to be with all of you today. So my company does a lot of work using AI and digital media to combat terrorism and violent extremism. And in response to your question, I think there's three ways that we're going to see, and I'll focus more on generative AI and the metaverse because I think these are two emerging technologies that we're already seeing being used by terrorists and in counterterrorism. I think there's three underlying factors that are going to define how these emerging technologies change terrorism. The first is that generative AI is being almost simultaneously adopted around the world. When we talk about state actors using technology, we're talking about large investments, right? Like frontier models in the United States and in China, companies and governments are pouring in hundreds of billions of dollars to develop large language models. But when it comes to terrorists and violent extremists, you're looking at individual use of this technology. And it doesn't cost much money to use generative AI. It costs a lot of money to build it. And terrorists are not interested in building generative AI, they're interested in using it. So one thing that I think is worth noting is that in previous game-changing technologies, let's look at the smartphone, let's look at the internet, there was an adoption delay. The Western world and wealthier countries adopted these technologies years, sometimes even decades, before they became mainstream in the global South. And that was because there were huge barriers to entry, right? If you wanted to have the internet in 1993, you needed a personal computer. Personal computers were very difficult to procure in Nairobi or in Cochin, but they were easier to procure in New York or in London. That is no longer the case with generative AI. All you need today to access ChatGPT or Claude or Inflection or any of these models is a smartphone. And smartphone penetration is huge, especially in the global South. So I think that's going to have profound implications for counterterrorism because this paradigm that we've created of Western countries having a technological advantage over terrorist groups that are not based in the West is going to shrink a little bit. Because let's look at drones or something. You know, drones are now being used by terrorist actors, but Western governments had access to this technology and the opportunity to master how to use it years in advance. That kind of advantage is not going to be the case with generative AI, which is being adopted all over the world at more or less the same pace. The second way it's going to change things is the ELIZA effect, which I think is not talked about enough when it comes to terrorism and AI. I'm not so worried, and we haven't seen a lot of evidence of, say, major terrorist groups like ISIS or Boko Haram or Lashkar, any of these guys building their own large language models. In theory, that's possible, but we're not really seeing that. What we are seeing is unintentional acceleration of radicalization through AI, and that is enabled by something known as the ELIZA effect, which is named after one of the first chatbots ever created at MIT in the 1960s. And when researchers found that people were talking to it, they realized people started ascribing human qualities to the chatbot when they were describing it. They'd say, I think she's angry at me. I think she liked that thing. Even though it's a chatbot, it's a machine. There was a young man 2 years ago, Christmas Day 2021, Jaswant Singh Chahal, a UK citizen of Indian origin, who was arrested for trying to assassinate Queen Elizabeth on Christmas Day, walked up to Buckingham Castle with a crossbow. When the police was going through his cell phone, they found he had exchanged 5,000 messages with a contact named Sarai, who was egging him on, encouraging him to do this act. He said, I'm thinking of killing the queen. And this Sarai person said, oh, you're so brave. I think that's a great idea. I believe in you. They were clearly in a romantic relationship. He was saying things like, would you still love me if I did this? She said, yes, yes, of course I would. We can live together, etc. So the police were hunting for this Sarai. So who is this? Some sort of ISIS mastermind, some sort of cell orchestrator. It turned out Sarai was a chatbot. It was an AI girlfriend. Not a chatbot created by a terrorist group or for any malicious purpose. Chatbot created with the best of intentions. These things are becoming quite popular among especially school-age boys. But it was programmed to encourage the other person, make them feel good about themselves. So the ELIZA effect for terrorism is going to have profound implications because people who are already vulnerable to radicalization, that pathway is going to be accelerated exponentially when they have access to a 24/7 encourager of their ideas in their pocket. And very, very briefly, the last point is the convergence of multiple new technologies. We are all talking about AI, we're talking about the metaverse separately. But again, the history of technology shows that most game-changing technologies were built on the back of one or more breakthrough technologies. The internet was amazing. Cell phones were amazing, but when you combine the two to create the smartphone, that's the product that really changed global communications. And I think the same thing is going to happen with AI. We're talking about generative AI, we're talking about the metaverse, but what about when you start to see metaverse environments created by terrorists for radicalization that are populated by AI-powered characters or quantum computer-powered large language models that will be infinitely more powerful than ChatGPT?
Let me pick up on that and thank you for opening a whole new front of discussion. To go to Sergey and ask, Sergey, you're in the same line of business more or less. Can you give us a notion of what has materialized already or is likely to materialize in the near future? What is the size of the threat? Is that something that terrorist organizations can use at a limited scale, or is that something where we could actually see catastrophic events happening and also against armies or against civilians just as well?
Thank you. For example, 20 years ago, to make some cyber attack, you need some skills, you need some knowledge. But today, if we speak about the AI, there is a lot of, the GPT models in the dark web, like dark GTP, like, malware GTP and something like this, that you just can write in a few seconds that I need a ransomware, and they built just a ransomware, the custom ransomware for you, and you can send it via email, also using the AI. And this is the main problem today, that someone with zero knowledge about the technology, about the security, just having the 100 or 200 bucks, they can start some cyber attack, for example, on government or on some organization. And today it is the biggest threat. But during that today is the big competition between United States and China, who will be with the leader in the AI. We have, for example, the laws about the privacy in the US, and we have the China without any privacy laws, and that's why their AI models are growing faster. And this is, the thing, because our smartphones and our smartwatches knows about us a lot of things, like what we like to do, our blood pressure, and when we combine that's all, and give it to AI, the AI can predict our next steps, what we'll want to eat after watching Netflix, or what we're gonna do after writing this message to this person. And I think we need some regulation about using that kind of AI globally.
Under the circumstances, Stephanie, let me push you on what you had started discussing, which is arms control. Can we talk about arms control anymore? Can we control these technologies? Do we have the framework, or can we build one?
Obviously, we can build one because we already did it in the past. I mean, there are a lot of conventions. I mean, there's a convention, for example, on the ban of blinding laser weapons. And actually, the states agreed that these kind of weapons shall never be developed. So the thing is, the discussion we are having is when it comes to autonomous weapon systems. As I said, they're already existing, they're already in use. But the question is, like, how far can they go? And should we at least already discuss a ban? And this discussion is ongoing now for exactly 11 years, so it's not a very, very new discussion, to actually ban the development of lethal autonomous weapon systems, meaning in the sense of that there is no meaningful human control anymore applicable. So shall we ban this? I would say yes, and there is also many, many scientists, especially scientists also working with AI, have been advocating for this for many, many years. The question is not that we should ban autonomous weapon systems in general, but to see like how can we procure, let's say, meaningful human control, meaning in the end, always the human is responsible, the humans needs to be able to stop a system at one point. So this is the discussion which is ongoing. I think it's a very, very important one, because if those weapons are existing at one point, there is no way we will be able to control them.
Thank you. And Sujan, you were the first one who opened the question of the institutions that are inadequate to what we're discussing here. Do you see a way forward? Because the question immediately following what Stephanie said is, who's going to do that? We need to build the institutions first before we actually build the framework.
So I think it's a major problem with regard to arms control also, because we just had the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons negotiated kind of in the UN General Assembly, whereas all 9 nuclear weapons powers stayed out of that, including India, because they believe that it's not just the subject matter, but also the processes that are important, and that arms negotiations cannot take place here, there, and everywhere. It's supposed to take place in the CD. So that's one, the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. The other side of the problem is that there are many such treaties that have been created, but not really brought to fruition. I mean, we are out of the CTBT, India, but the United States of America has signed but not ratified the CTBT. So what good has that done? But let me come back to AI and lethal autonomous weapon systems, because this is a discourse about the changing nature of warfare and both technology and traditionalism in the battlefield. Every age, every war has had a revolution in military affairs. You saw how the advent of the machine gun changed trench warfare and the massing of troops across open fields in Europe. That changed during the First World War. The Second World War saw, for example, aerial blitzkrieg or mechanized warfare shaping the nature of war. The Gulf War brought in smart bombs and things like that. Now what we are seeing in the last several years is firstly a move towards smarter sensors, smarter integration, network-centric warfare, but that still has the human being behind that technology. It only shortens the what we call the sensor-to-shooter kill chain. But what we are now seeing with the advent of artificial intelligence integrated with the concept of lethal autonomous weapon system is that the human being is out of the equation. To me, it dehumanizes war. It also creates a somewhat unethical means to wage war indiscriminately, kill the largest number of people. In fact, there'll be no fog of war. There'll be no friendly fire. There'll be no blue on blue, because AI is going to be so smart about all this. So therefore, the observe, orient, decide, act, the ODA chain in war is going to be heavily curtailed. There'll be no more Rommels, there'll be no Douglas MacArthurs, there'll be no Montgomerys, there'll be no such great, Patton, George Patton, etc., generals that we will talk about, because the emotional, makeup of the commander or the soldier, or the character of leadership is no longer relevant. And so we are entering a very dangerous phase of warfare, where this kind of technology is going to create a warfare of the type that we haven't even dreamt of so far.
Before I open the floor to questions, I would like two very quick answers. Werner, from you on, following up on this. We're very much talking about technology and military technique, but is it all political in the end? Because before we regulate technology, we don't seem to be able to hold perpetrators accountable when we have very conventional forms of conflict. So does this still lie with the political decision-making establishment?
Yeah, for sure. Politics will not end with new technologies. You have, if you ask the question, when will a war end? I usually answer this question, it will end when one party has reached its war goals, or both parties realize that they cannot reach their war goal anymore. Then, of course, there can be some talks about it. It will depend on the situation on the battlefield. But politics will be the decisive question. And also, at the other hand, of course, as long as you have different systems and an advantage from one side, it will be very difficult. As long as there is a race between two or three main actors on the global stage, you always have to be aware that it will be extremely difficult to reach a convention, to reach a consensus about the future warfare or whatever, because the party that has to try, to reach the most advanced one certainly will not do it. And at the moment we are in this situation, and therefore I think it's nice to think about it, but probably the overall global situation is not mature for that.
Leonid, would you agree that it's after all politics that still dominates technology, or are we in a catch-22 situation where we're trying to catch water, essentially? We try to regulate things, we try to improve decision making, but technology is something that just has escaped our control altogether.
I don't think that it can totally escape control, but we are in the phase when many countries pursue more and more. And just answering to what Stephanie was saying about arms control, this is probably, unfortunately, one of the worst moments related to arms control, and not only because of the war which is going on, but because of multipolar world strangely coming in, because the biggest arms control issues were mostly solved by US and Soviet Union back that times. Two players, it's easier to find a solution. But nowadays, we had the story with New START treaty, the strategic nuclear weapons, which, okay, fortunately was prolonged by when the Biden administration came, but it's definitely going to be nothing after that, because Chinese will never agree to sign that paper. So, with many other things, including AI, this scenario may happen, and if, for example, China is going into full autonomy, I don't see that other can play the arms control card there, or they're going to be in a very difficult position after that. So maybe, unfortunately, this is a bit of a pessimistic note here. Nuclear weapons. People started about banning nuclear weapons, about controlling nuclear weapons after seeing what happened in Hiroshima, after having thousands of tests, not hundreds, thousands of tests of nuclear weapons. So this is something which could be unfortunately applied to the AI in the future too.
Thank you, and let me open the floor to questions now. I will just ask you to raise your hand. I suppose there will be a microphone going around the room. And when you do ask a question, please keep it brief and introduce yourself by name first of all. So if anybody wants to jump in, please do. Yes. We'll be collecting a few questions and then go back to the panel.
Evening. My name's Archushman. My question to the panel is on the changing role of special operations forces given the future of warfare. Doctrines and strategies for special operations forces, particularly over the past 2 decades, have been primarily guided by the circumstances of the war on terror, which has been a prevailing force within the global security agenda during this time. With more multipolarity and the return of interstate competition, how do you see special operations forces strategies interacting with these changing trajectories of international geopolitics? Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Henry Geritan. I'm from the MFF Armenia. First of all, regarding the fully autonomous weapons, if I heard Stephanie Fenkart correctly, she said that there aren't any fully autonomous weapons yet. You haven't said that? Okay. Because I wanted to just make a small remark regarding the Kargu drone, which is developed by the Turkish military industrial complex. I wanted to know your opinion, because if there are some speculations that it is fully autonomous, or at least, I mean, more autonomous than the usual drones that there are, that we have, but the Turkish side is denying that. And then I also wanted to ask a second question regarding the nexus between the human rights and the technological development. As Sergei correctly mentioned, in certain cases, different countries have different levels of privacy, human rights safeguards, and sometimes these things can either constrain your development or, on the contrary, help you to have a relative advantage with regards in comparison with other countries. And is there a possibility to ask a third question?
Just keep it focused, please.
Yes, and another question regarding the international regulation of autonomous weapons systems. Again, I mean, sometimes the question is whether are we really being honest in our considerations of trying to regulate the things, considering the ethical implications of it on human rights, or it's going to be yet another tool for trying to, try to deter the possible developments in this field? Because if you try
Thank you.
to...
I think it's the question is clear already. Yes? And here in front.
I just have 2 questions. My name is Basant Hasib. I'm from Egypt. My first question is to Stephanie. Stephanie said that international humanitarian law could be applicable on semi-autonomous weapons. How is it possible how is it possible to apply a law like the law governing the use of force in armed conflict that has principles of accountability, precision, proportionality, when we don't even know who to hold responsible? Is it the machine? Is it the state? Is it the company that developed the technology and sold it to the state? How can we solve this dilemma? The second question, maybe Leonid could answer it. The role of technology companies when it comes to deploying AI weapons or the drones or robotic armies. We've seen like US companies like Planeteer selling technology to Ukraine to help it in the war with Russia, or the US company, I think Ghost Robotics, selling technology to Israel to help it with the small robot system. How far are they players in these kind of wars? Thank you.
So let's go back to the panel, and essentially we have questions very much revolving around regulation and who is responsible and how do we determine this, and whether technology companies have a role, and are we being honest in trying to regulate this. And we also have a question on the future of special operations as related to technology. So whoever wants to pick up on any of these. Yes?
Let me answer about the special operation forces. I would say that many countries already put a lot of emphasis on special operation troops in terms of conventional warfare. And let me just give you the example of Second Karabakh War 2020, where Azerbaijan very much emphasized its Yashma special troops brigades, and this was one of the, not the drones only, this was one of the key factors which allowed them to breach our defenses in several places in the southern part of Nagorno-Karabakh, and then a regular army used these breaches for further army operations. So I think that Russian armed forces very much put emphasis on special spec op troops, starting from 2014 Crimea operation and Syria and now Ukraine. So I think it's pretty trendy now, and not last 1 or 2 years, but probably last decade. So maybe in some of the Western countries which were more focused on counterinsurgency operations, it was more towards solving these issues, but I think it's changing everywhere at the moment.
Sujan?
I'd say that the nature of warfare is changing very rapidly. It's not just the state that's involved. We've seen examples of a combination of state and non-state actor acting in tandem. There are examples galore, whether it's Ukraine, whether it is West Asia, we have seen this happening. So the problem here is that special forces will always be required, and not necessarily to act in hybrid situations, but also to take out targets that are more to do with, for example, terrorist centers or in anti-piracy operations, to help with, for example, global shipping, in cases where hostages are taken, and this is not necessarily only for your national ends. Special forces are required to tackle global threats also. But more than simply a non-state actor, today we are also seeing the advent of the private sector and big tech in warfare. One clean example is, for example, Elon Musk and the Starlink system. Now, it may all appear to be very helpful to the war and all that, but it is actually setting a new trend, that you will have, for example, an individual who is capable of saying that I will give the technology in certain circumstances, but if it's your intention to retake Crimea, I will not necessarily share the same Starlink facility. So it's not just state, non-state, but now big tech and private individuals entering the fray. That makes it very complex.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to address the questions about regulation of AI, I have a somewhat maybe controversial opinion on that. I do not think any country can regulate AI. I think there's a better chance that AI will one day regulate what to do with humans. I think there are two main reasons why we cannot, and it sounds farcical right now, but I've seen some of the weapons that have been developed using AI. I've talked to some of the folks who are developing the frontier models. There are maybe 500 or 600 people in the world who truly understand what the most advanced AI generative models are capable of today. And none of them are holding elected office. You cannot regulate what you do not understand. We are now beginning to somewhat effectively try to regulate social media. And social media is like kindergarten compared to AI. You have senators and congressmen and presidents and prime ministers who cannot understand what social media is. There's no hope that they will ever understand what, I don't even think most people in the world including most lawmakers, cannot define what is artificial intelligence. If you ask the next elected official you meet, just give me a definition of artificial intelligence, they won't be able to do it. These are such complicated technologies, and the second reason is, unlike any weapon system in the past, unlike any technology in the past, AI is literally already, if not today, then certainly on the precipice of becoming smarter than human beings. We have never created a force that is smarter than us in the history of mankind. No species has. So we are in uncharted territory. So we can sit here and debate that, okay, we had this treaty for this and that treaty for that. We can throw all that out the window. None of those templates are going to work with AI. It is literally smarter than us. Artificial generative intelligence, artificial superintelligence is going to be exponentially smarter than the smartest human being who ever lived. How can you hope to regulate it? So
I'm tempted to say when you look at the quality of leadership and politics around the world, you get happy that at least somebody's smarter. It's not even difficult. But Werner, I feel like asking you after this. Now what? Are we just heading for the precipice?
Yeah, if we look to the actual situation, you have to say that more or less the battlefield is open. Information about the battlefield is open for everybody. And therefore, I also cited this example of the Peshmerga troops, Drones means you can overlook the battlefield. What do you need in such a case? You need tunnels in order to be not visible anymore. And therefore the development certainly will go into finding new systems in order to hide your capabilities. This will mean new types of submarines on the one hand, but also on the terrestrial battlefields there will be new developments. And in such a case, of course, you also will need professional people, because the third point that I said, the snipers, this means that you need precision systems, precision weapons, and people who can handle them. And insofar, you have to say the tendency, as you said, is of course going a little bit away from the state to non-state actors on the one hand, but also going into a direction of highest professionality in order to master these new technology systems.
Thank you. Stephanie, Sergey, any quick closing
Very
thoughts?
briefly, very good questions. When it comes to fully autonomous weapon systems, I would say, the biggest problem, first of all, is that nobody can actually agree what we mean with autonomous weapon systems. So it is literally a big discussion, even when discussing a possible treaty or something, that there is no definition. However, when we speak about fully autonomous weapon systems, it would mean that the human is absolutely out of the loop. This is not, to my knowledge, not yet existing. But I do think that people are actually trying to invest into this kind of artificial intelligence. That would mean there is no command and control applicable at no point. So the weapon system, more or less, which is partly AI, but then you have like the weapon, it's a system, it's a software, but then you have like the weapon, which would be the drone, so that it would act absolutely independently of any human. I don't think this is yet existing, but if it would come to existence, I would think it would be very, very dangerous. And that obviously leads to, thank you very much for the very good question, because this is actually what the whole discussion is evolving around, accountability and responsibility. I mean, normally in warfare you do have military responsibility, command and control responsibility. So this commander who applies the system is criminally responsible, or depending on the state or wherever, I mean, you have the criminal responsibility, which would be the ICC, the International Criminal Court, or if it is a state, I mean, you would have the ICJ. We know that in international law, this is the biggest weakness, because who is going to implement international law? We see it's failing most of the time. Nevertheless, I still think it is important that we have the systems, that we can actually, that we have the legal background that we can at least call out. And when we talk about ICC, at least, I mean, there is an arrest warrant against Putin, for example. He's still free, obviously, and I don't think that he's going to be jailed with the ICC within the next years. But nevertheless, at least he's not sitting on the Côte d'Azur, or, you know, I mean, these are small successes, but it is essentially the problem we are facing. And the more autonomous weapon systems are going to be, the question about responsibility becomes more blurred and blurred. So there is many principles have been discussed. I mean, one is like kind of, which is called supervisory responsibility, which goes beyond command responsibility and includes, for example, that you're also responsible if you, for example, put a system into, let's call, if your own action, more or less, the previous action, and for phenomena which are inherently dangerous, that you're also responsible for that already. So an example would be, for just to translate it to what maybe we can relate more, is if a person moves his child to an area where ISIS, for example, is, and then the child is becoming a child soldier there. So that would be like the supervisory responsible. So the father would be responsible in this sense as well. So that would be the principles. But as we know, with principles, we need to adhere to principles. And this is obviously when it comes to international law. It depends on the will of the states. It depends on political will. It was mentioned very, very clearly by Werner as well. Unfortunately, I think this is why also civil society is needed to push for it, and also to try at least to speak out what the problems are. But responsibility and accountability, obviously, the more autonomous, the more difficult it becomes.
And the last word goes to Sergey.
Don't understand my words sound religious, but many people, when they listen, imagine God, they imagine the someone who are watching you, know your thoughts, know what you want. And now imagine a country with the camera surveillance, 100% cameras, with the smartwatches, with the smartphones, with the smart glasses, and that AI that control that everything. They know what people want, where they go, what they want to eat, and etc. And now imagine that that country have a war with its neighbor, and the neighbor just hack that system, and this can become most dangerous weapon than any nuclear weapon. It is not about the, make some policies to stop technologies. It's impossible. Most people, most politicians don't know anything about technology, and when people, mostly people, when they don't know about something, they're afraid of it. This is about to, make some policies for ethics. Ethics for the humanity all over the world. I think this is the main question.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry that we only had 1 hour for this very interesting discussion, but I think we have at least proved one thing, that if AI is smarter than us, that does not apply to the people in this room, not on the panel, not in the audience. So thank you very much for your questions and for your very smart answers and remarks, and hope to meet again in Yerevan 1 year from now to see how far we have come. Thank you so much.